Oh, hi. My name is Skylar Stanley, and I am one of the 3 senior producers for Mountaineer Media for the 2016 to 2017 academic school year. This video is part of the tutorial videos that we started doing this year, for which you can find an introduction right here. One of the reasons that I was put on the Mountaineer Media staff was because of my background in photography. I have been a photographer for about 7 years. Part of being a good photographer is understanding how lens choice influences your image. And a lot of those concepts translate to filmmaking. A lot of novice filmmakers think that your choice of lens just influences how zoomed in you are, but that is not the case. By the end of this video, I hope that I can teach you some of the fundamentals about lenses so that you can become a better filmmaker. To start, let's go ahead and look at some of the lenses that you have access to as a member of Mountaineer Media. On the 60D is the 85mm t1.5, and I'll go over what those numbers mean later. Here is our Tamron 10 to 24mm wide-angle lens. This is our 35mm t1.5. This is our Canon 18 to 135mm kit lens, and this is our newest addition to the Mountaineer Media lens lineup. It's a Tamron 70 to 200mm f2.8 fast telephoto lens. So when I say a number and then I say millimeter, that is referring to the focal length of the lens, which you can think of how zoomed in the lens is. Let's go ahead and see what these lenses look like in action. I have set up a tripod with the 60D on it, and I'm going to go ahead and take short clips with each lens on it so you can see what different focal lengths look like. Here is our widest lens. This is the Tamron 10 to 24. Notice how there is a lot in the frame. Here is the Rokinon 35mm t1.5 prime. We use the word prime to denote when a lens has a fixed focal length. That means you cannot zoom in or out with the lens. I'll go over what the t1.5 means later. Here is our Rokinon 85mm t1.5. Notice how zoomed in we are getting now. And finally, here is our fast telephoto lens, the Tamron 70 to 200mm f2.8. Notice at 200mm our image is quite different than what we saw at 10mm with the first lens. So seeing all of these short clips taken with lenses at different focal lengths, which is what I'm talking about, millimeters, might leave you wondering, why does focal length matter anyway, and what are the differences that we find in each of the lenses? Focal length matters for a great number of reasons. As a filmmaker, you can use focal length to isolate your subject. This is for 2 reasons. 1 is perspective distortion, and 2 is for depth of field. Let's go over both of those terms. Perspective distortion is best explained visually. In front of the lens is the Pathfinder Bear, located near the library. Right now, I'm using the Tamron 10 to 24mm wide-angle lens. I've tried to position the Pathfinder Bear so that the top of its head and the bottom of its feet nearly touch the edges of the top and the bottom of the frame. What I'm going to do next is change the lens to our telephoto lens and reposition myself so that the Pathfinder Bear looks more or less like it's positioned in the same place in the frame. Notice what happens to the background. The background appears closer to the subject. It's not like the background is actually closer to the subject. Those trees did not move closer to the Pathfinder Bear, they just appear to be closer. That is perspective distortion. It's important to note that I took these clips on the Canon 60D, which is a crop censored camera. What that means is that when I say focal lengths as affiliated as shot on the Canon 60D, that focal length is actually greater. That is because of the crop sensor, and Luke is going to go over that in more detail in his video about different types of cameras. To talk about that other concept that I mentioned, depth of field, we first have to understand another component of our lens, the aperture. Think of the aperture as an adjustable hole in the front of your lens that influences how much light passes through the lens. You can either make this hole really wide or really narrow. Again, the aperture is part of our lens, even if it is something that we can adjust with our camera, which for some of our lenses we can do. Some of the apertures we adjust manually on the lens itself. This old Minolta lens of mine does an excellent job of showing what that looks like. It has a click adjustable aperture. Traditionally, aperture is measured in f-stops. F-stops, in a sense, just indicate how wide that entrance pupil, that adjustable hole, is. The actual measurement of an f number is the ratio of the focal length to the width of that front entrance pupil. It's easier just to think of it though as how wide that front pupil is. A really wide aperture corresponds with a low f number, and a really narrow aperture corresponds with a really high f number. For instance, this Tamron has a maximum aperture of f2.8. That means you can still adjust that, you can stop it down to f8 or f10, and you do that in the camera because this is one of the ones that you have to adjust the aperture actually within the camera. But that means when it's at its maximum aperture, the hole that is in the front of the lens can get pretty wide. With some zoom lenses, however, changing your focal length influences the maximum aperture that the lens can have. For instance, on this Tamron 10 to 24 millimeters, at 10 millimeters, the maximum aperture you can set it to is f3.5. At 24 millimeters, on the other hand, the maximum aperture you can set it to is f4.5. If you want to understand more of the mechanics behind this, I highly recommend that you take Physics 140 as a general education class. There's an entire unit about optical systems and how aperture influences things like depth of field. You may have remembered before when I was talking about these prime lenses that I said T1.5. I did not say f1.5, I said T1.5. That's because some lenses are measured in t-stops, not f-stops. T-stops are very similar, except for t-stops indicate exactly how much light reaches the sensor instead of just that front entrance pupil's width. This is important because in some zoom lenses, when you have additional glass between that front entrance pupil and the sensor, you have some light lost. So the f number doesn't necessarily correspond with how much light reaches the sensor, and it's variable between different lens manufacturers. In my experience, although I don't know if this is true, t-stops are used more in the world of filmmaking, although as a film student, you should be able to masterfully utilize both. Besides just allowing more light to go through your lens and reach your sensor, which would make your final image brighter, aperture has another effect, and that is called depth of field. If you've ever had a professional photo taken of you, you may remember that in the photo, you were in focus, but the background was very much not in focus. Think of that as depth of field. Specifically in that example, that is a very shallow depth of field because you have a very narrow plane of focus. Your aperture directly influences this. Specifically, you get that shallow depth of field when your aperture is wide open. In this example, I am using the Rokinon 85mm T1.5 to film the screaming elk thing that's near the University Center. To start, I have the aperture wide open at T1.5. Look at the background. You can barely make out any detail in the buildings and snow behind it. But as I change the aperture and stop it down to T22, not only does the image get darker a little bit, but you can actually make out details in the buildings and in the snow behind the screaming elk. Being able to incorporate this knowledge into your filmmaking is super valuable. Isolating your subject with a shallow depth of field adds great cinematic quality to your image. Now that we have a heightened understanding of the mechanics behind our lenses, let's go ahead and actually look at the lenses and try to understand the markings that are on them. These prime Rokinon lenses have two rings that you can adjust. The front one influences focus and the back one influences the aperture, again measured in t-stops. Our zoom lenses are similar in that they also have two adjustable rings. One influences focal length and the other adjusts focus. The ring's relative position to one another is dependent on what zoom lens you're using. Like I mentioned before, with these Rokinon prime lenses, you actually manually adjust the aperture, but with these Tamron lenses and the Canon lens, you adjust the aperture within your camera settings. By all of the rings on the lenses, there are numbers. The numbers by the focal length ring are self-explanatory. The numbers on the focus ring, on the other hand, represent how far something needs to be in front of the lens to be in focus, either in feet, meters, or both. When you get towards the greater distances, some of the markings will end in an infinity sign. When set to infinity, that means that everything beyond the distance mark below it will be in focus. An example use of that is like when we set our wide-angle lens to infinity when we did a time-lapse of the Milky Way. These things here are called lens hoods. They act to block something called lens flare from getting into your image. Lens flare is the result of sources of light causing unintentional image formation, like internal reflection and scattering from material imperfections in the lens. I am not a film student at Western, but my understanding is that some of the film professors absolutely hate lens flare inside of the videos that you make. When you are not using one of your lenses, always ensure you put the front lens cap on. This prevents scratching and dust. The same goes for the rear end cap. You should never have this off unless you are changing lenses. If you have it off, dust can get inside the glass inside your lens, which is not good. You can also scratch the glass that is inside your lens, which is also not good. You might notice on some of the lenses we have these circular clear filters that look like this. These are called UV filters. They don't really serve any function besides protecting the front piece of glass on the lens from getting scratched. Do not take these off unless you have an absolute need to. If you do, I will find you. Please don't do it. So that's it for now. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned some about the different mechanisms inside the lenses and how they influence your image, which are absolutely crucial to understand if you want to become a better filmmaker. My name is Skylar. Thank you.